moment. Here's a piece of me to chew on.
Hi everyone. So today I think we're going to talk more about cannabis. Well, I know we're going to talk more about cannabis. So why could something like cannabis, a naturally growing plant that occurs in every, climate zone except in the high desert and the coldest places like the Antarctic or the Arctic, it's everywhere. It's a naturally growing plant. How can this have become such a taboo subject in such a large part of the world? I think we have to go back to looking at not the fear propaganda around this plant, but to look instead at ethical and financial, in other words, power, political power, as reasons for why it's become this way. If we go back to about the late 50s, early 60s, we can establish the fact that cannabis was not a big deal. It was available in most most pharmacists carried various forms of cannabis. In Sweden, which is very, very restrictive and negative in its approach towards cannabis, you could go to the regular pharmacy and buy something called Cannasol, and it was basically just cannabis oil, and it was meant to alleviate winter depression. And in 1960, American politics, in an attempt to control the young civil liberties movement, actually made a politically motivated incentive to try to limit the access to cannabis. And the reason for this was very simple. They had found that in the US, Native Americans and Mexicans within the society, they used cannabis as a form of relaxant. In the same way that in example, in the Scandinavian cultures or the Russian culture and Northern European culture, we've used alcohol. Alcohol has a long tradition of shutting off emotions and shutting down parts of the brain so you don't worry so much and life isn't painful. Problem is with alcohol, the effects are very negative. The many like side effects of alcohol. So how could something like cannabis, reach a point where in countries like Sweden it's held and demonized, even to the point where it's considered to be on the same level as heroin, which is probably next to alcohol, the worst of all the so-called drugs in what it does to people. Well, political control was and is very much the main reason for this, because there's money invested. Initially, like I said, it was a way to try to control the civil liberties movement, but it was also strongly motivated by the forest industry. Now, in countries like Sweden, the forest industry is dominant, is highly dominant, together with steel and weapons. And in this, there came, for the forest industry that creates paper and everything that comes with this, was one of the biggest industries in the world. Cannabis is a problem because it can be grown in fairly large amounts, and it's extremely productive, and it can be produced with very little assets. You don't need a lot of money to invest into the product to be able to create, in example, paper, to be able to create textile, to be able to create rope, to be able to create medicine. Now, in a world that's very, very materially and capital driven, this becomes a threat. So basically what we can see historically is that cannabis is just a commodity. It's just one commodity, and it used to be just like any commodity, like wood or steel or ore or gold or oil. However, it's a commodity that most people can grow in their own backyard. So we're stuck with the fact that the reason for why it's been kept illegal and why today it's considered more or less to be a political problem is that it's so hard to regulate, and that's why it's become what it's become. Now, if we look at the reality of cannabis today, we're looking at about 130,000 people working worldwide full-time with cannabis. They produce cannabis in various ways. They produce anything from hemp textiles to oils to ropes or to building material, and there's the medicinal and recreational production of the flower. It is already a multi-billion-dollar industry. It is, in fact, at the moment, even an industry that comes to threaten some of the existing industries, because it contains so much potential for profit. So there's so much incentive from certain power consolidations to kind of push it to the side and make it a low priority. Now here comes the ethical arguments about it, is that when it comes down to it, telling someone what they're allowed to or not allowed to eat or drink or put into their own bodies comes back to how we view the individual, like the basic narrative of the individual's rights in a society, any society. It is also revealing that this fear of cannabis really brings forth a strictly materialistic and even martial view of the human. To accept the existing, the old paradigm from the late 50s and up until now, and the ideas around cannabis, you have to accept certain basic ideas. You have to accept that humans are not free. You have to accept that it's not your own right to decide over yourself. Now, that's not progressive, and it's not humanitarian, and it's not democratic. It is, in fact, feudal. It is the same basic view of the human being that we had in the 1500s, or even the 11th or 12th century. It is a perception of supremacism. Supremacism built in, classic thievery. Nothing more, nothing less. Now that's very provocative to some, because they don't want to be portrayed as thieves. But a thief is simply someone who takes from others without giving something back. It's a lack of consequence. That's thievery. And so basically, if we look at what supremacism is, supremacism in its core is nothing but thievery. The supremacist is an individual or a mindset or a path of reasoning that says that I don't have to take consequences. I can simply take. You deal with the consequences. And until you can make me deal with the consequences, I win. Now, for me, I can't possibly accept that kind of rhetoric in my life, and I think that most adult people really don't want to. So it comes back to, how do we deal with that? Well, that's where we have to start looking at how we perceive ourselves and how we perceive reality. And this is a form of responsibility. It's a question of, do I want to become an adult, or do I want to swoop through life with as little conflict or consequence as possible? Most people would go with the latter. They'll say, well, I don't want conflict. Well, the fact is, without conflict, without a certain level of suffering, you cannot evolve. That's a fact. So this brings us back to something I was speaking to John earlier about, which was intelligence. And this is not a popular subject to talk about. It's not very politically correct, because if you talk about intelligence, most people will intuitively believe that it's judgmental. Now, intelligence is not a linear thing. Intelligence is not based on IQ. You can't say that a person who has 180 in IQ is a smart person, because having 180 in IQ means nothing. You can be completely dysfunctional. You can shit your own pants and not really understand that you did, and still have 180 in IQ. So we have to reevaluate the idea of intelligence. Most people in this society, and I'm talking about the Western paradigm, the idea that saturates European and American and Russian culture, is one that really does not like intelligence. Most adults, and there's a great deal of studies, about 90% of adults have the equivalent in intelligence of an adult baboon. So they're emotionally, they're on the maturity level of an adult baboon, a 12-year-old child. And that's functional enough to do what other people tell you to do. That's functional enough to accept conditions presented by someone else, but it's not going to help you to make your own decisions in order of how you're going to develop yourself as a human being, and it's not going to help you grow. So that comes down to the basic fact that to do that, you have to make a choice. And to make choices, that demands courage. So now we just got to start looking at what the hell is courage. Well, that's a lot for today, I think. Take care, everyone. Like us and write little comments, because we love comments. Take care. Alak Baba Sirishandirak.
'Cause you won't find it.